After a Grip-Tite wall anchor job has been sold and scheduled, it is important that you call your local utilities locating service to make sure that all underground utilities have been marked. You will also need to speak with the customer when you get to the job to make sure that they have not installed any private utilities such as a sprinkler system or electrical line. It is very important that all OSHA regulations are followed when installing Grip-Tite wall anchors. It is also important that you use the proper safety equipment such as eye protection, ear protection, and steel-toed boots. In the following video, the measurements and examples are for an 8-foot high, 8-inch thick wall. The first step when installing the Grip-Tite wall anchor system is to locate the horizontal placement of the wall anchors on the interior of the foundation wall. The best way to mark the wall is to use a small piece of duct tape. If there is a stair-step crack working down from the corner and or up from the corner, you will need to place the first wall anchor between the corner and the crack. If there are no cracks, place the first wall anchor no more than 3 feet from the corner and the rest of the wall anchors no further than 6 feet apart on a block wall. If the foundation wall is poured, bricked, terracotta, or clay tile, you would place the first wall anchor no more than 3 feet from the corner and wall anchors every 5 feet thereafter. If there are vertical cracks in the wall, you will need to place a wall anchor so that the Grip-Tite wall plate covers the crack. Depending on the condition of the wall, the anchors may need to be closer than 5 or 6 feet. In some cases, the wall anchors may need to be as close as 2 feet together. Once you have located the placement of the anchor on the interior of the foundation, you need to locate the exact same vertical location on the exterior of the foundation wall. Again, use duct tape to mark the location of the anchor on the exterior. There are several ways to make sure that the mark on the interior and the exterior are in line. If it is a block wall, you can count the hollows. Remember, there is at least one extra hollow on the exterior corner than there is on the interior. If it is a poured wall, you will need to measure the distance between each anchor. Remember that when you locate the first anchor on the exterior, you need to add the thickness of the wall if you are measuring from the exterior corner. Another great way to line up the location of the interior and exterior marks is to use a benchmark that goes through the wall, such as a water line, electrical line, or window. After marking the location of the anchor on the exterior wall, you will need to mark the location of the hole where you're going to place the earth anchor. For a standard 9-foot rod, you will need to measure 8'6" from the exterior of the wall if it is an 8-inch thick wall. This distance can vary depending on obstacles such as utilities, driveway, sidewalks, flower beds, decks, and the location of the property line. If you need to use a distance that is shorter than 8'6", you will need to use a combination of all threads and locking couplers to get to the correct length of a rod into the anchor hole. If you need to go further than 8'6", you can use locking couplers, all threads, and a long rod. After marking the location where you are going to place the earth anchor, you need to dig the hole. Before starting to dig the hole, you need to determine where all underground utilities are located. Even if you have called the local locating service, you will still need to go inside and see where the utilities enter the house and talk to the customer to make sure there are no personal utilities such as sprinkler system or electrical lines. Once you have located all the utilities, you need to remove the grass in the area where you are going to dig the hole and set it off to the side so that you can replace it at the completion of the job. In order to make backfilling the hole and clean up much quicker, you might consider getting several tarps that are 6 foot by 6 foot with a hole in the center to put the dirt on. After you have moved the grass, you should center the hole in the tarp over the place where you have removed the grass. There are several ways to dig the hole. You can use a shovel and a post hole digger, a Kubota tractor, or other small piece of construction equipment with an auger. If you dig the hole by hand, you will need to dig it about 16 inches wide, 10 inches across, and at least 4 feet deep. If you are going to use an auger on a piece of equipment, we recommend that you use a 12-inch auger and dig the depth of the auger, at least 5 feet. With the earth anchor hole dug, you now need to determine the height of the soil on the foundation. This may vary as you work your way down the wall. It is important to pay attention to this height because it will determine the height that you will place the anchor rod on the interior. Once you have determined the soil height on the exterior, you will need to go into the basement at the anchor location marked by the duct tape and measure down from the exterior soil height on the foundation 26 to 30 inches, depending on the location of any horizontal cracks. The placement of the anchor hole should allow for the top of the anchor wall plate to be just below the highest horizontal crack. An excellent way to mark the location of the anchor rod hole is to use the wall plate as a template. At the anchor rod location on the foundation wall, you will need to drill an 1 1/8" hole through the foundation. This is a critical part of the anchor installation process. After you have determined the height of the anchor rod, you will need to view the contour of the landscape on the exterior so that you drill the hole through the foundation at an angle that will place the anchor rod in the earth anchor hole 36 inches below ground level. With the hole drilled through the foundation, you are ready to prepare the Grip-Tite anchor rod to be driven out to the earth anchor hole. You will need to wax both ends of the anchor rod using bowl wax. You can use toilet bowl rings from your local hardware store or buy it in 5-gallon buckets from Grip-Tite. On the end of the anchor rod that is going out to the earth anchor hole, you will need to wax all of the threads. On the end that will remain on the interior of the wall, you will need to wax all of the threads plus an additional 16 inches of anchor rod. If your earth anchor hole is more or less than the standard 8'6", you will need to make sure that you have 24 inches of all thread between the wall plate and the first locking coupler on the exterior. With the anchor rod waxed, you are ready to drive the anchor rod out into the earth hole. You should do this either by hand or with pneumatic tools. If you drive the rod out by hand, you will want to use a large sledgehammer. Once you have pushed the anchor rod out as far as you can by hand, you will need to use 2 Grip-Tite nuts on the end of the anchor rod, so the second nut is sticking out past the end of the threads. This will protect the threads and also give you a larger area to hit with the sledgehammer. If you choose to drive the anchor rod out using pneumatic tools, you will need to use a Grip-Tite rod driver on the end of the rod. When placing the rod driver on the rod, you will want to screw it all the way on and then turn it back 1/4 of a turn. This will keep the rod driver from locking onto the rod. Using a chipping hammer, such as a Chicago Pneumatic CP 4123, connected to a 125 CFM or larger gas air compressor, drive the anchor rod out until it is 5 inches into the anchor hole. The anchor rod needs to be a minimum of 36 inches below ground level. If the anchor rod is less than 36 inches below ground level, you will need to pull the rod back into the basement, re-drill the hole, and drive the anchor rod out again. If you pull the rod back into the basement, you will need to use a Grip-Tite rod puller. You connect the rod puller to the rod using a Grip-Tite locking coupler. Then use the sledgehammer or rod driver and chipping hammer to drive the rod back into the basement. With the anchor rod showing in the earth anchor hole, you are ready to prepare the hole for placement of the earth anchor onto the rod. You will need to dig the hole a couple inches wider than the earth anchor so that it will fit into the hole. Once you have the hole wide enough, you will need to make sure that the part of the hole that is closest to the foundation wall is flat. This will allow the earth anchor to seat squarely into the earth when you are tightening it. Remove enough of the loose dirt that has fallen into the hole so that the earth anchor will easily slide onto the anchor rod. Now that the earth anchor hole has been correctly prepared, you are ready to install the earth anchor onto the anchor rod. Start the earth anchor into the hole with the welded nut retainer facing away from the foundation. Lower the earth anchor into the hole until you are able to slide it onto the rod. Slide the earth anchor onto the rod until it is tight against the foundation side of the hole. With the rod exposed behind the earth anchor, place the nut onto the rod. The nut has 2 distinguished sides. The tapered side needs to be placed towards the earth anchor so that it is easier to seat into the nut retainer on the earth anchor. Screw the nut onto the anchor rod so that 3 or 4 threads of the rod are exposed past the nut. With the rod exposed past the nut, you next need to pull the earth anchor back so that the nut is seated into the nut retainer on the earth anchor. With the anchor nut placed into the nut retainer, use a long-handled shovel to push the rod so that the earth anchor is tight against the foundation side of the hole. Make sure that the nut stays seated into the nut retainer of the earth anchor. You now have the exterior ready, and it is time to go back inside. Once you are inside, you need to slide the Grip-Tite wall sleeve onto the anchor rod. Place the wall sleeve on the rod tapered in first. If you cannot slide the wall sleeve all the way in by hand, you will need to use a Grip-Tite sleeve driver and hammer to drive the sleeve the rest of the way in, making sure that the sleeve is 1/4 of an inch past the interior wall. After driving in the wall sleeve, you will need to seal the hole around the wall sleeve with bowl wax. Once the hole around the wall sleeve is sealed with wax, you should place the Grip-Tite wall plate on the anchor rod. Place the wall plate on the rod so that the flat side of the wall plate is against the foundation. Next, place the Grip-Tite backup plate on the rod and then the Grip-Tite washer. Now that you have the wall plate, backup plate, and washer on the rod, you need to place the nut on the end of the anchor rod with the flat side facing the wall plate. Then place a second nut onto the rod so that the nuts are touching. With the second nut in place on the anchor rod, you are ready to tighten the anchor. With an 1¼ wrench on the nut closest to the wall and using a Grip-Tite torque wrench or 1/2-inch drive impact wrench and Grip-Tite heavy-duty socket on the nut closest to the end of the rod, tighten the two nuts together. Now that the nuts are tightened together, use the torque wrench or impact wrench to tighten the nuts to the wall plate. While tightening the double nuts, you will be turning the anchor rod towards the wall plate. With the nuts tight against the wall plate, you will be pulling the earth anchor towards the foundation and seating it into the earth. Once the earth anchor is seated, continue to tighten the nuts until you have reached the required torque pressure for the type of wall you are anchoring. If you are anchoring a block wall, you will need 80 torque pounds, a poured concrete wall, 90 torque pounds, and a terracotta or clay tile wall, 60 torque pounds. Once you have reached the required torque pounds with the double nuts, you need to remove the nut closest to the end of the rod. This is most easily done by using the 1¼ wrench on the nut closest to the foundation wall and reversing the torque or impact wrench to remove the nut closest to the end of the rod. With the second nut removed, change the direction of the torque wrench or impact wrench to the tighten position and tighten the single nut to the required torque pounds for the type of wall you are anchoring. Once you have tightened the anchor to the required torque pounds, you need to cut off the excess anchor rod. Using a sawzall, cut off the part of the anchor rod that is sticking out past the nut. After the excess rod has been cut off, clean up any mess that you may have created in the basement. Now that you have completed cleaning the basement, you are finished on the inside and ready to go back outside and complete the installation of the Grip-Tite wall anchor system. Now that you are back outside, you need to replace the dirt into the anchor hole. You will need to tamp the dirt as you replace it back into the hole. There are two main reasons for tamping. The first is so that water will not easily get into the hole, allowing the earth anchor to be pulled into the wet earth towards the foundation. The second is so that the dirt will not settle after you leave, causing you to have to go back to the job site on a service call. There are several ways to tamp the dirt back into the anchor hole. One way is to use a tamper plate such as a Bosch HS 2125 tamper plate with an HS 2173 shank in a jackhammer. This tamper plate will work in both an air and electric jackhammer. Another way is to use an air backfill tamper such as an American Pneumatic Tool Model 131. When replacing the dirt, place 8 to 12 inches of dirt into the hole between each time you use the tamper. It is very important that all of the dirt is tamped back into the hole. Once you are done tamping, remove the tarp and rake any loose dirt that may be on the grass into the hole.